Okay. And I'll try to take questions along the way. So if you want to try them in the chat, if I see a hand, I'll try to jump on that way. Otherwise, if you are inspired by a question that can wait till towards the end, that's fine as well. And then we'll take questions until enough people drop out that it's a clear signal that we should end. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I am going to go right out of the chute and share the screen and get to it. Let's see here. Right, let's see here. Right. Can folks see that? And can folks hear me? Good. Okay, I see thumbs up. That's great.
Clear.
Great. All right, let's do this. So what happened, right? I got a lot of texts and emails uh, during election night and the last couple days. Obviously, down ballot is not what we expected, and it has a lot of consequences for the next 2 years. So let's take a look at what happened, and first, let me start with the nuts and bolts. Many of you will know this, or at least the gist of this. As of about an hour ago, and the number continues to change. Really important point to keep in mind for the rest of the evening here. In the presidential, these are all the two-party vote. So take out Jill Stein and Robert Kennedy and write-ins and all that. As of a few hours ago, and this number's been dropping throughout the last couple days, Kamala Harris won the state with only 51.39% of the two-party vote. Most polls thought that she would win by 6 to 8 points. So clearly there was some late-breaking action. The governor's race, which was the real kind of anvil around the ankle of down ballot, ended up going from what looked like a 2 or 3 point race, maybe 4 point race, to what now is more than a 9 point gap between Ayotte and Joyce Craig. As of a few hours ago, Craig received 45.3% of the two-party vote. The Senate is 16 to 8. We did not flip any seats. Two of the seats that we had, as you'll see in a moment, the two most vulnerable seats went to the GOP, though one of them will go to a recount, well, possibly. And then the House, pending some recounts, is at 222 to 178. That's a net loss of 20 seats for Democrats. And then finally, the Executive Council remained 4-1. Frankly, that was always going to be a difficult mountain to climb because of the nature of how those districts are gerrymandered. Uh, we have the one really blue seat in Karen Leod Hill. The other four did not go our way, and frankly, were not terribly close in most cases. So that's what happened. I want to talk about the PVI. Many of you have heard this before, the Partisan Voter Index, and it measures how well your district does compared to in statewide elections compared to the state overall. In 2022, the Democratic performance, that is the two-party Democratic average vote, was 48.37%. When you use it as part of a historical average, it entered 2024 at 48.64%. That is what the expected average to begin the 2024 cycle would have been. You can see it's been floating around 48 and a half or so for quite a while. Then on election day, based on up to the hour numbers, it ended up acting like a 48.3% number. That's a really big deal because, as you'll see in a moment, there were, for much of the last couple of months, it looked like we might actually be at 50 or 51% in terms of expected Democratic performance at the top of the ticket. That would have had a tremendous lift to the bottom of the ticket. Instead, it ended up almost identical to 2 years ago, and that had real consequences. So, as you see, on those of you that watched Monday night, the night before the election, the expected PVI, which was dropping, But on election eve, it was 50.83. And it ended up, that's 2.5 points higher than what ended up happening. And that cost probably the two, well, it did. It almost certainly cost the two Senate seats and probably cost 20 to 25 House seats, that delta in terms of down ballot impact. So these were the next three slides were the slides from election eve to give you the context. The best reasonable case scenario had floated throughout the projections from August all the way. We did 4 versions of them publicly, and you can see that the early October one, version 2.0, was sort of the high point in the projections and ended up being at 56%, with Joyce getting 53%. This was best reasonable case scenario. It started going down over the course of late October, and you can see that the best reasonable case by the time we got to election eve had gone down to Harris at 54.5%, Joyce at 51. And if that had happened, we were looking at 230 House seats and a potential majority in the state Senate. We then moved to the 50th percentile. And in the 50th percentile, this was the median outcome. You can see Harris would get about 53.2%. Joyce would not win, but she would get about 48.5%. And the dead center number of the range was 208 House seats and a Senate that was going to be very competitive, where we gained 1 to 2 seats. That obviously did not happen. Here's what ended up, the 20th percentile, which was the worst reasonable case, is going to look pretty familiar. It projected that Harris would get 51.5%. She's currently at 51.39. And Craig would get 46, and she is currently at 45.3. So with that scenario, the median of the range of outcomes was 186. That was in the worst reasonable case, the 20th percentile. Well, here's the problem. It ended up lower than that, although Harris, we almost nailed it, and Craig was about 0.5 point lower than that. So here's what it looks like. The 20th percentile, you see what that was, same as the last slide. The actual up to the minute is a little lower for Harris, 0.7 point lower for Craig. That's a 15th percentile, and it means that you end up with roughly 175 House seats and 8 to 10 Senate seats in that projection. I ran it after the election. What did we end up with? 178 House seats and 8 Senate seats. So the good news, I suppose, is the model remains very accurate because it doesn't predict what will happen at the top of the ticket. It predicts what will happen depending on what happens at the top of the ticket. And it does that really well. Unfortunately, the models reflect the polling, as Nicole Bump asked. So the model works, but it's only as good as the polling data. To some extent, that's accurate. And you can see that nationally at the presidential level, as you all know, it looked like it was going to be a tie at the presidential level. And then Trump ended up consistently outperforming it by sort of the top of the margin of error, roughly 3 points in his direction. It turns out in the 7 swing states, he outperformed the model by more than 5 points. And in the non-swing states, it was much closer, only about 1.7 points. So clearly their campaigning in the 7 swing states made a key difference. And we'll get into that because here in New Hampshire, I think we saw some of the effects of that as well. So here's what it looks like. In the last 4 elections, the actual Democratic baseline on election day, you can see what it was. It's not hit 50, 2016 almost, and then it dropped to 46, 48.5, 48.3. The night before the election, it looked like 50.8 based on polling. And then look what it ended up being. Basically identical to 2022, 48.34 according to the latest numbers. So why is it stuck in the 48 range over much of the last decade? The short answer, our struggles at the gubernatorial level. We are consistently winning federal races. We are consistently losing the gubernatorial race. We see here the regional campaign director in New Hampshire told me the Harris internal polls was a 3-point race 1 week before the election. And certainly, I mean, it ended up that was the case. So the public polling was at the end catching some of this, but not to the full extent. So let's talk about the House a little more. Entering the election night, the estimate was that there were 178 House seats that were likely or safe. Coincidentally, Democrats ended up winning exactly 178. The GOP had 168 that I rated as likely or safe. So that meant there were 54 seats left that were going to determine the balance of power. Based on the median political environment, Democrats would have been favored in at least 30 of them, which would have put us in a strong position to get to at least high 200s or low 210s, which is what the model was projecting. Unfortunately, obviously, that's not what happened as it went down. So, in the election night model, election eve model, the range was 197 to 219. In the 18th, 15th to 18th%, where we're at now, it's roughly 170 to 185. And so there's a few things that come out of that. The loss of a couple of points, in this case, 2.5 points, is a really big deal and has the effect of 20 to 25 seats in terms of likely outcome down ballot. That's how sensitive the top of the ticket is. And yeah, again, the polling, public polling ended up being inaccurate, although again, as you'll see in a moment, it did capture the trajectory, just not the full extent of it. So some of you might recall there were 43 seats. That is most of those 54 that were not in likely or safe territory. These were the key 43. These were the House candidates based on quantitative and qualitative measures likely to be in the closest races. Many of these had been high priority for many months for Move the Goalpost. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these were the 43. And they are ranked, they're ordered in these next few pages by how Democratic performing the district they're in was. So you can see that out of the 43, only about 7 were in Democratic leaning seats, many of them in Manchester. You can see Hillsborough 19 and 26, 4 seats in Manchester. Cheshire 11, that we'll talk about in a moment, is in a very blue collar southwestern Cheshire County district. Greg Sargent was trying to replace Dan Wolf, the most moderate Republican left in the House. He retired, and Greg ended up slamming that one. He won it handily. And then Henry Noel. I started my day in Berlin on election day, in part because I was so worried about Berlin. And it turns out we should have been. Not only did Henry end up losing, Corinne Cascaden and Eamon Kelly, all three in a Berlin-based, 2 different Berlin-based districts, all 3 of them lost. In fact, we now have no seats in Coos County. So it was a real concern and obviously warranted. You can go down the list and you can see Barry Faulkner and Alan Gross in another blue-collar Cheshire County seat. Others in Western New Hampshire, Jen Ramsey, you can Jolene Farmer in Grafton County. We had some Hollis seats in here. You can, I'll have this up as well, and you can look at these, and of course you can ask questions about any of these seats at the end. Some of these were trying to grab extra seats in suburban places like Goffstown, Merrimack, and Bedford. And some of these were trying to make inroads in some of the reddest places where we had seats trying to protect Charlie St. Clair and Mark Vallone, who ended up winning 2 of the big winners that survived Tuesday night, and Al Turcotte, who did not. In Bedford, we ended up holding our 2 seats, but not expanding. We ended up not getting a seat in Wolfboro. So with the exception of Mark and Charlie, it was real tough sledding in most of these districts. Question from Paul Phillips. Steve, the model is based on trend lines. Was this a trend line election or an outlier election? And if the latter, why? Okay, that's a good question. Hold that question. There'll be some charts in a moment that may get at that. And if it doesn't satisfy, please let me know. So here's how the key 43 did. There were 43, only 10 of the 43 won. In 2022, I had a key 33, and we went 19 and 14 in those 33 races. Basically, we needed to win 2/3 of them in 2022. The environment, the math required us to get about two-thirds of them. We almost did, which is why we almost got the majority. We started in a more commanding position according to what the baseline appeared like it was going to be, which meant we only needed to split those 43 to get a majority of around 210. Unfortunately, we only won 10, and indeed, we even lost some of the others that I did not put on the 43. There were some real upsets on the list. There were 3 points that I want to highlight um, uh, in the, whoop, let me close that for a moment, specifically that really had major impact and that we all need to think about as we think about 2026 and beyond. And here are 3 points I want to make. A lot of folks not in Cheshire County, I don't know how many folks we've got here from Cheshire County, but a lot of folks not in Cheshire County think of it as this very blue place, mainly because there's a perception that most of Cheshire County is basically like Keene. Well, here's the thing. That's never really been true, and that's becoming very untrue. A lot of western and southern Cheshire County is moving in a red direction very quickly, mainly because they're pretty blue collar. So whereas in places like the Upper Valley, where Hanover and Lebanon real estate values are so high that it's sort of leaking their extreme blueness into out down 89 and even towards Claremont. That is not happening right now in the Keene area. Let's look at some of these districts and you'll see what I'm saying. So on the left, I ranked all 400 seats by their democraticness. And you could see, for example, Cheshire 6, which is out in western and southwestern New Hampshire, was one of the bluer seats or pair of seats really in New Hampshire. It's in the top 100. It entered the cycle as a D+6. But look at that middle one, difference in PVI. That is how much over the last 2 years it had been moving either in a Democratic or a Republican direction. Anything over a quarter point is a fairly significant move in one election cycle. Well, look at some of those numbers. So Paul Birch and Catherine Harvey luckily both won. But for a district that's D+6 entering 2024, they were pretty close. That was a highly competitive election, in part because it appears, and in the next several weeks, I'll have the numbers, all the numbers done. I suspect that these communities moved it further towards the Republican Party in a very rapid fashion. And that's something that we have to watch. Dan Eaton, probably this was one I had a warning sign about because his district's been moving red for a while. But the estimation was Dan was so entrenched as an incumbent. He had such a high PAYCO score, outperforming generic Democrats so much in his district that I thought he was probably safe, as you can see in the far right, with the best case, median, and worst reasonable case scenarios in the yellow. And then the green is how many seats we actually won. Dan ended up losing by a couple dozen seats. This is a great example where the difference between Joyce getting 46% instead of 45.3, that's absolutely one of the seats that went because it dipped even lower than the worst case scenario, reasonable scenario of 46%. That's a very good example. I was very worried about Cheshire 10. We ended up losing one of the seats. Alan Gross ended up being defeated, and that is becoming a tougher and tougher district. It is now a Republican PVI. Winchester, you could see it moved almost as fast as any district in the state. We have lost it the last 2 times. We lost it again. This is 3 in a row that we lose. And it is going to be a red district in terms of its PVI no later than 2028. We're going to really have to focus on that if we're going to take it back. You can see Cheshire 12. Jack Geddon's great guy, good candidate. Look how fast that district's moving. Even Jaffrey Dublin, which is moving slightly in a blue direction and is a D+3. Dick Ames is a well-established, well-respected incumbent. Very tight race. That one ended up being less than 100 votes. Ringe, I put on. It's one of the reddest in the state. That, unfortunately, was not close. And then 2 of the ones I was most excited about, Cheshire 17 and 18, wonderful candidates in both districts, ended up not being terribly close in either of those districts because it appears that they lurch to the right in this election cycle. So these are a lot of Cheshire County seats that many are moving in the wrong direction. And I think that we all as a party are going to have to really think about, um, is this something that we can reverse and address? Is this part of a bigger trend line, the way that Coos County has become? Because outside of Keene, there aren't a lot of really safe seats anymore in Cheshire County. Here's the second big point I want to make about some of these seats. Manchester, and those of you that have been on the shows or been to some of the in-person events, been really worried about Manchester here for the last 4 years or so. It is moving in many parts very quickly in a Republican direction. Look at some of these districts. Um, in Manchester Ward 10, where we had two strong incumbents who both retired at the same time, it's a light blue district moving rapidly, masked by the incumbency that we had. And without the incumbency, we lost one of the seats. You can see in, um, let's see here, in Manchester Ward 8, we lost both seats. That is becoming an extremely difficult district for us very quickly. In Manchester Ward 5, which is only D+1, it actually lurched blue in the last cycle, but it appeared to lurch back. The long-term trend has been moving red, and we actually lost one of the seats there. Manchester Ward 7, which is only D+2, it also appeared to lurch, and we lost a seat there. So we're losing a lot of seats. We even lost a seat in Manchester Ward 12, Julie Smith, who's wonderful. Unfortunately, she didn't survive this one, and that district has been slightly moving red. It appears to have continued to move red. There's a lot of movement going on. Manchester Ward 11, which Joyce lost to Kelly. She lost Manchester overall, which put all of these candidates in a tough spot. But Ward 11, which is where I was born and raised, D+8, but look how much it's moved. It's one of the 10 fastest moving towards Republican House districts in the entire state. Luckily, Patty and Nicole survived, but this is one that I worry very much about in the long run. It is a blue collar district. It has a high Latino population. As you probably saw, Donald Trump got 45% of the Latino vote. He got 54% of the Latino male vote nationally. In Manchester, this is a real thing. We have to really think about this. These are trend lines that have been on the way for a while. I see Paul here. Manchester is being gentrified. Lots of wealthy folks pushing out working class voters. Parts of Manchester definitely are, and we see that in other cities, Nashua as well. But the parts of Manchester that are more working class, east side, frankly, parts of the east, the south, and the west, are all generally lurching towards Republicans. It's part of the reason why Victoria Sullivan was able to defeat Donna Soucy. It's part of the reason why Joyce was able to lose Manchester to Kelly. I mean, these are real problems that we need to address because we have local elections next year, and obviously it's the biggest city. It's about 8% of all House seats in New Hampshire are in Manchester. 3 state Senate seats have part of Manchester. So you can't succeed, certainly as a Democratic Party, if we're not doing well in Manchester. Question by Rosemary. Is Manchester going Republican a product of the mayor being Republican or vice versa? Great question. I would say it's the vice versa. I would say that the new Republican mayor, the Republican-leaning Board of Aldermen, that is more a product of what's been going on, the tectonic plates of politics moving in Manchester and elsewhere, more than the other way around. Although Republicans clearly now are smelling blood in the water, and obviously we need to be proactive on this, or it could get worse before it gets better. Somebody asked, Linda, how did Joyce do in each ward? I'm going to have to spend a little more time to be able to identify that. But my understanding is in the north end, Joyce generally did better. The trend lines broadly, and I'll confirm this, and we'll do a Manchester program in the relatively near future because it's so important. Looks a lot like national. Ed Staub, who sent me a really good email earlier today with this, in Manchester, even low participation voters are going R. Near the end, that's a big point I want to make. for many, many months, I've been telling folks, generally speaking, the higher turnout is, the worse it will be for Democrats, which is the opposite of what you've been hearing for 20 or 30 years. And the reason for that, low engagement Democrats, low engagement undeclared and independent voters align in terms of their values, which are cost, inflation, cost of rent, cost of groceries, cost of fuel, cost of heat, and immigration and crime. That lines up very well with the priorities of Republican voters. High engagement Democrats have been prioritizing abortion, the environment, LGBTQ, Trump's malfeasance, and democracy. That is not what low engagement Democrats are worried about right now, in no small part because low engagement Democrats are lower income, lower educational attainment. And if you're making 35 grand a year, you're worrying about paying groceries. You don't really have the luxury, frankly, to be able to think a lot about climate change, abortion, democracy. These sound like pretty high-minded things when you're sweating out how you're going to heat your home this winter. And we have seen this now for many, many months. I'll show you some graphs in a few minutes. This was coming down the pike. We saw it on election night nationally. Donald Trump sought to expand the electorate because he knew he could not get the 5 or 7% of undecided voters. They were not going to go to him. They already knew Donald Trump. He's a known entity. So he knew if he tried to win it by getting those people in the the small sliver, the kind of Liz Cheney Republican type, it wasn't going to work. That was the bet Kamala Harris was making. She could squeak it out by winning most of that 7% or so of mainly disaffected Republicans. The problem, Donald Trump said, I'm going to try to win by expanding the electorate. I'm going to try to expand my working class base to non-white voters. He crushed that. He's going to try to get lower engagement men and men in general into the game. That's why he was doing everything from Joe Rogan to a slew of other similar type podcasts aimed at men. As a 50-year-old guy who listens and watches to some of that stuff, I was receiving a tremendous amount of Trump-centric communication over the last several weeks. They were definitely aiming at men, and the men responded. And the gender gap with men ended up being bigger than the gender gap with women, which ends up being a real problem for Democrats. So I see Linda says here, Sullivan County had many same-day registered new voters, majority Republican. Also, I was at 9 different polling locations on election day. I talked to a number of people. I teach a graduate course at the Carsey School at UNH. And one of my students was holding signs for a Republican candidate in Merrimack, the town of Merrimack, which was a zoo. He was there from 12:30 till I saw him just before 6. They had a separate line, like many towns did, for people registering same day, because if there were so many of them that to put them inside the building would have really cluttered it. And it was a beautiful day in most of the state. So he was able to count male versus female people that were in the line all day, because we had talked in class about this dynamic before the election. And he, in the 5 hours that he counted before I got there, it was about 65% male. This all checks out. This was a strategy. It worked. We can talk a lot tonight and in the future about the Democratic Party's struggle with men. I have firsthand experience that would confirm a lot of that. It is not always a friendly place to be somebody that looks demographically like me and a lot of people like me. And unfortunately, I think that we are in this election, we're paying a price for that. Let's see here. So let me continue on to the third category, the suburbs. I spent time in almost all these places. This is what I call suburban arrested development, because we have been making enormous gains in the suburbs, both in New Hampshire and nationally, for a long time. That has been the key to our success over the last several election cycles. See that difference from PVI, that blue column in the middle? That suggests that in every one of these suburban districts, they have been moving in our direction. Sometimes, like in Bedford and Amherst Milford, very rapidly. Well, the good news is some of our great candidates survived. Megan Murray, although that was a kind of sneaky close race, Kat McGee survived, but we lost a second seat. We were able to hold two seats in Milford, but it was not an easy environment. In Merrimack, where we originally had hopes of getting up to five, you can see that as the projection was heading downward, so were the best and median case scenarios. We ended up with the three. We lost our seat in Goffstown. We were hoping we might be able to gain seats. Bedford, we held on to two, and we were fortunate to do it. And I'm very saddened that Karen Calabro, who I love, she was in the flotarial that included Hollis, Brookline, Greenville, Mason, and she lost her race. That was a difficult race in this environment. So the long run for suburbs, I hope, is better off. But Kelly Ayotte was a really good suburban candidate. She inherited a lot of the Sununu juice on that. As a woman, she may have even pushed the gas pedal a little more on that. And the overall environment, including a lot of these same-day registrants, we didn't lose a ton of the suburban seats, though we did lose a few, but we didn't continue the momentum that we've been seeing recently. I'm seeing a lot of other folks that are saying that they saw similar trend lines in the same-day registration. Yeah, look at this. Paul Phillips, this is really interesting. I spent several hours registering new voters in Plymouth on Tuesday. Mostly they were PSU students. At least half of them were registering as ours. This is in a college town. But for the first time in 20 years I've been doing this, I saw 15 to 20% of new voters being older voters who had not voted in 8+ years and were coming back all as Republicans. I saw the same thing. I completely agree. Um, and we'll get to the gubernatorial element in a moment, but the suburban thing was a really important point to make. In the long run, I'm still optimistic, but we certainly got hit and we slowed down our progress there. So let me talk about the Senate for just a moment. We had 8 truly safe seats and 2 more seats that we held that would have survived in my model pretty much anything down to about the 20th percentile. The problem? We dipped below the 20th percentile, and that ended up costing us 2 seats. The GOP had 9 seats that were pretty darn safe. That left 5 seats. If we had hit the median number, we would have been favored in 1 to 2 of them, almost certainly Matt McLaughlin, and then probably either Ben Ming or Stu Green had a shot. But in that environment, obviously we did not get that environment. Let me check the chat here. Does the huge increase in new registrants mainly mean the PBIs need to be adjusted? The short answer is the PBIs will be adjusted now for the 2026 cycle. By sometime in late November, early December, I'll have it all cleaned up with new 2026 numbers to kind of begin the new process. And the PBIs we saw were the kind of up to the minute based on the last several cycles voting behavior. So we're going to integrate that in. It will, in effect, include new registration. And so we may see some pretty radical changes in some of the PBIs, just as we would around the country. I mean, something that some of you I've seen, for many years now, that I was a candidate for governor in 2018. In 2017, I started very early, and I went to many of your districts, many of your town committees. One of the things I would always say, and Trump had just gotten elected, was the thing that we don't know about Trump. Is he a transitional figure or is he a transformational figure? It was too early to say. Because he has been in our life and will be in our life now for about 13 years, from when he started running in 2015 to when he leaves office in the early 2029. We must, and because of what happened Tuesday, experts around the country on both parties, the more I look at the numbers, the more I'm coming to the conclusion, for better or worse, Donald Trump is transformational. I've been saying back in 17 and 18, you got Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, Ronald Reagan. Every 40 years or so, we're due for a transformational figure when the last movement loses gas and the coalition splinter. Well, what we've been looking at for the last several years is a splintering of the coalition. It's been very messy, 50-50 elections, very messy. But we are now looking at a realignment, or at least it sure looks like it could be. And it means that what we call conservative and liberal are fundamentally changing, and that the Republican Party is settling in now as the blue collar party, the working man's party, the disruptor party, and that we are becoming much more of the high education, high income, much more women than men, suburban, and frankly, we're becoming whiter but in a certain way. That it's not complete yet, and it doesn't mean it's destiny, but it's going to be very important for Democrats between now and 2028 to define what we are as something other than not Trump. Because for over a decade now, for 9 years, we've been defined as not Trump. And that's obviously A, not working, and B, not really relevant for what's going to come after Trump. So we need to be thinking about what it's going to mean to be a Democrat in an affirmative and proactive way. Let me quickly look before we go to the next slide at some of the comments here. Let me scroll back up here. Here we go. Let's see here. Yeah, Jim Belay, I'm glad you're here tonight. Not surprised with the new or returning. There's a lot of these folks that fell off the rolls. They were targeted by the Trump campaign. They were seen as the kind of targets that they needed to get back in the game because they needed to expand the electorate. I see here from Gary Hoffman, I really wish National Dems had spent more PAC money here. We could have easily countered the inflation argument. It is true that the gubernatorial race got a ton of money, the DGA, but this was not seen as one of the 7 swing states. And if you were not one of the 7 swing states, you didn't get the juice. And clearly it turns out this was a closer race like it was in a lot of places around the country. So the DGA and RGA spent wildly here. And as you'll see in a moment, that has major impact on the, sorry about that. Let me get back here to our, there we go. Okay. To our, the gubernatorial has massive impact. And let me see if I can get this here. Sorry about that little issue. All right. Why is this not working here? Let's see. Okay. Oh, there we go. Why is that not happening? Sorry, guys. Let's see here. I'm going to stop the share for a minute and I'm going to redo it so we can continue. There we go. This should work now. All right. These were the Senate seats that ended up being in the conversation. There were 2 that we held, but they were marginally Republican seats. Shannon Chandley in a very suburban district and Donna Soucy in a relatively conservative chunk of Manchester. Donna, for me, was always the upset special because her opponent, Victoria Sullivan, people focus on the fact that she was, she's kind of out there. But when she ran against Joyce Craig for mayor the second time, when she wasn't particularly competitive in the overall numbers, she actually beat Joyce by about a point in the wards that are part of Donna's district. Then you add Litchfield, which is about an R+8 district. And as soon as it was not a 50% type environment, it was going to really put Donna at risk. And when Joyce lost Manchester, and I can guarantee you she lost this collection of wards, I'd bet money on it. Donna was in a real tough place, and that's probably the big upset of the night in that race. I see Stephanie Payor here. GOP message: stay on the Sununu path. And 8 years of GOP control has not made life better, but folks are not catching on. We need to focus on the finances more. Here's the thing. If people didn't know a lot about Joyce, they knew more about Kelly. And at the end of the day, Kelly and Chris Sununu, they campaigned together. And Kelly's last couple weeks, her ads consistently said, we're going to stay on the Sununu path. Sununu, for the 8 years he's been governor, has been popular. We have failed. We failed in 8 years to make an argument that would put a dent in him. The best shot we had after he won of beating Sununu was 2018. I ran that year. I'm very familiar with it. It was an environment where the right candidate could have beat Sununu, and we didn't get it done. We had a great night down ballot because the overall environment was historic, but a certain kind of match has a chance at beating somebody like Sununu, and we just never put the right match together for that. I always thought a Gen X versus Gen X was your best match. We have to match his charisma. We have to match his energy. We just never got there. And if you can't put a dent in his popularity, then it's going to be transferable. And it was. And that was a big deal. Look at this, though. I mean, look at those numbers on the far right. These were the results on election night. I would argue Matt McLaughlin was our best shot to flip a seat. And you could see he almost did, even in this environment. If the environment had been the median, Matt absolutely would have won. He came within 3 points in what ended up being a pretty dreadful environment. You can see Donna would have won in a neutral environment. Shannon clearly would have won in a neutral environment. The other races were very consistent. Look at that. They were all between 55.5 and 56.9. So those were all pretty challenging, but they needed at least the neutral environment. If it had been, it needed to probably be an above average environment for these other four, it turns out. But Matt and the two incumbents would have won in a neutral environment. I feel very confident saying that. Before we get, let me just check this out real quick. Yeah, okay. So there's some basic, before just go into straight Q&A, there are some big picture lessons and reflections that I wanted to share. We've touched on some of these. The first one, these are things we've been talking about at the virtual and in-person events throughout this year, indeed throughout the cycle. One, highly engaged voters now lean towards Democrats, but less engaged voters now lean towards the GOP. I just grabbed a couple of charts. This is not new. This is before Biden's debate performance. People that voted in the state primaries in 2022 supported Biden by 5. The same was true with Harris in similar polls. People that voted in the 22 midterm but not a primary, Biden by 1. People that voted in the 2020 presidential but neither the midterm nor primaries, Trump by 2. And people that did not have recent voter history, even in May, before the debate debacle, supported Trump by 14 points. They saw this polling too. They knew if they could get people that didn't usually vote to show up, they knew that they were disproportionately men. They knew they were disproportionately worried about cost of all the types. They were worried about immigration. They feel like they are being disrespected and they're unplugged from the system. And Donald Trump basically said, I respect you. Come on out. I'm going to worry about your issues. And they did the outreach. And a lot of you saw them walking into the polls and voting for Trump and voting for Kelly. Look at this. These are the same people that were polled. What'd you think of the economy? People that thought the people that think the high engagement voters, frankly, disproportionately high income, college degree, they're the kind of people that are showing up at all of the committee meetings we go to. Even in May, they were saying good or excellent. But as soon as you drop down at all, look how quickly people said the economy is poor. People at the highest level, high engagement Democrats, look at the stock market, they look at GDP, they look at macro factors. Folks, downstream of that, the bottom 3 categories, especially the bottom 2 of engagement, cost of eggs, cost of gas, cost of heating oil, cost of rent, cost. And on election day, they felt like Republicans were talking about it in the way they wanted to talk about it. Percentage of people in these 4 buckets that said that either abortion or democracy was the top issue. At the top, and this is why they're Democrats, the hardcore people, 42% said one of those 2 was the top issue. But look how fast it goes down. Why? Pretty much everybody else is worried about the economy and immigration. and that occurred on election day. In the exit polls from the presidential election, we saw the same thing. Um, that was so that's one reflection. Here's a second one. The model was catching the trajectory of the decline in the baseline in the final week of the before the election, and the final actual Democratic baseline ended up looking a lot like the original model that I ran in August. So look at this. You can see that in mid-September, the projection was the highest I've ever had it since I started doing this in earnest in the last 5 years or so, over 51.5%. It sort of stayed up there until about mid-October, and then look what happens. Every time I would rerun it, which became very frequently in the last 3 weeks, it started dropping. And so the trajectory of it was, the model was beginning to say, hey, something not good is happening with the top of the ticket. The polling was beginning to reflect that. Let me take it one step further. When we first did the model back in August, it was down in the 48% range. And then the polling that you see, the big spike, a lot of that was the brat summer that we heard about with Kamala Harris. This really represented her at the high point. There was also some early gubernatorial polling that showed that it was going to be highly competitive, but you can see that it starts turning the corner and has a steep decline at the very end. Of course, it ended up being a lot steeper than we thought it would be. And that happened around the country. Let me look at the, yeah, I mean, look, I'm going to be honest, and I'm glad to have this discussion in the weeks and months to come. A lot of men feel that the Democratic Party is not for them. Some of you have heard me tell this story before. My dad, who is a retired carpenter, didn't go to high school, much less college. He's an immigrant, naturalized American, loved Bernie. He loved Bill Clinton. He liked Bernie. When Bernie didn't win, he voted for Trump. And in 24, my mom and dad voted for Trump. When I asked my dad, why are you voting for somebody who's kind of against your economic interests as a blue collar retiree? And he said, there's something more important than my economic interests. It's my identity. And my dad said, Steve, frankly, your party makes me feel like being a blue collar, straight white guy makes me not a good person. And why would I want to be part of a party that makes me feel like I'm not a good person? We can dispute or discuss why that is, but he's not alone. And in the exit polling this week, there's a lot of that comes out. And my message for today is, it's not like we have to pick whether or not we respect men or women. We could do both. But and certainly we should, because the consequences of not doing it are pretty tough.
The woman's called Craig Savage started right in, I'm not sure if it was racism or sexism and stuff like that.
I think I hear somebody. I'm not sure if you were asking a question or if I just caught you with the mic off. Not sure that was. Let me go back to the screen one more time here. All right, let's see here. I'm going to do this one more time because we're having the same hiccup. All right, got one more point here, and then we'll get to Q&A. Here we go. So, any of you that saw any of the presentations the last 2 years, I would show this slide and I would wait. I tweaked it a little bit because we're now past 2024. The single biggest factor that will impact the fate of our down ballot candidates in 2026, just as it did in 2024, will be the performance of our gubernatorial nominee against Kelly Ayotte. It was the number one thing that we should have considered when in the primary. I don't think Cindy would have done significantly better or worse than Joyce. Frankly, it's very difficult to beat a first-term incumbent. Here's the reality of the history of New Hampshire over the last 40 plus years since Papa John H. Sununu first won in 1982. Incumbents are 13-1. The one loss was Craig Benson, who barely lost to John Lynch in 2004. There have been 7 open seats This was the seventh. Republicans are 5-2 in open seat elections. What is the thing that the two that we won have in common? Anybody want to take a stab at it before I tell you? It was the same opponent, Ovid Lamontagne. In the 7 times it's been an open seat in the last 42 years, Jean Shaheen beat him in 96. Maggie Hassan beat Ovid in 2012. And that if you run an almost entirely abortion rights related campaign against Ovid Lamontagne, that's going to work. Ovid, who has been the attorney for the Diocese of Manchester and is about as strong a pro-life, anti-same-sex marriage, Republican, conservative as you're going to get, that works. When you go, you oppose abortion even in the early weeks, he'll be like, you're damn right. And in New Hampshire, that's enough to win an election. But when you run against not that, it's very difficult. Again, those are the only 2 times we've won an open seat in the last 42 years. And I don't think our strategy can be, we gotta try to, we gotta hope Ovid Lamontagne runs again. He's getting older. That's not a great strategy. And we can't hope that the Republicans nominate somebody who's as overtly a pro-life zealot as somebody like that. I think a lot of folks were hoping Frank Edelblut would run in 2024 because Frank is probably the closest thing that we have right now in the political stratosphere of somebody who would kind of fit that zealot, certainly on school choice, on abortion rights, and on other issues. But of course, he didn't. And when Kelly Ayotte said, look, I promise to veto any changes to the abortion law, we may feel like that there's something to not trust there. But clearly enough voters felt like that was good enough for them that they were able to move on to the next issue. And so Chris Sununu was seen as pro-choice to enough voters that it was not an issue. And now Kelly, if she doesn't touch the abortion law for the next 2 years, I think we can be honest tonight and say it's not likely going to be a discussion in 2 years if the law indeed does not change in the next 2 years. If it didn't work now, it's hard to see how it would work in 2 years, unless she changes it, right? Unless she goes back on what she promised to do. So we're going to have to really think in 2026 and beyond, what is it going to mean to be a New Hampshire Democrat? What is it going to, in a proactive, positive way? Because we need our down ballot candidates to have something to attach to, just as the Republicans for the last 5 elections have been able to attach to Sununu and Ayotte in the absence of specific information about the specific down ballot candidates, which, let's face it, a lot of these low information voters don't know who the down ballot candidates are. That's not what drew them out. So they just go down the ballot based on the brand at the top. We're going to need to make sure that the brand at the top of our ticket, specifically gubernatorial in 2026, is a strong, affirmative, charismatic brand. It's got to be a really good brand. Let me see here. I mean, I heard a lot of candidates tell me, even Tuesday, a lot of the mailers that went out on behalf of the candidates were abortion related, which was motivating for high engagement Democrats. But I'm going to be honest with you, those folks were always going to turn out. We didn't need to motivate high engagement Democrats. They were the ones that were coming out. It was cost and immigration that was going to drive lower engagement Democrats and undeclareds. And in New Hampshire, property taxes are never a bad place to go. And some of you did a really good job of that, but you were running into the wind. If Harris is getting 51.3 and Joyce is getting 45.3, I'm looking at Chuck now on my screen. Chuck Grassley is about as good a candidate as you can run in that Rochester district. He literally tied it and then blew out the special election a few months later. Chuck's brand is as good as ever, but you can't win a race in basically a +0 or an R+1 district if the top of the ticket is getting 45.3% statewide which means, and I haven't looked at the numbers, she's probably struggling to get 44% in Chuck's district. And I could say the same thing about Jenny Ramsey. I could say the same thing about the Alan Gross in Swansea. I could say that to about 30 of the candidates who could have won in a different environment, but we're asking them to run up a hill that's just a little too steep. I'm quickly looking at some of the other, let's see. Steve, talk about how New Hampshire Dems fared versus other states. Did this red tide affect other states as badly? Uh, I, I don't know about as badly, but in virtually every part of the country, and I mean it, every part of the country, versus the only group of people that Trump did not make real improvements with were college educated women. That is the only group that he did not make legitimate inroads. I mean, I want to restate, he got 54% of the vote of Latino men. That's an unbelievable. It's difficult to overstate the magnitude of what Trump just pulled off. I mean, purely from a political operative point of view, it's remarkable. It was remarkable and impressive work. They had a strategy. They were going to get lower engagement voters. They were going to expand their opportunity, and they did it. This was something national. Let's see. Oh yeah, here's one. Ezra Klein's interview with Richard Reeves. Men and boys are not okay. Like I've heard a lot of different interviews, and there's a lot of literature out there that, in terms of how we're educating young boys, we need to adjust that. And there's some research going on there. I think that we need to talk about what masculinity looks like. And I've heard candidates on both sides of the aisle that are increasingly understanding that this is a real problem. It's related to mental health. It's related to academic success. It's related to potential careers. There's a lot to chew in here. Diane McCarthy notes basically, look, there's still some sexism. I don't want to overlook that. Clearly, there's an element of that. But I would also say non-college white women lurched very hard towards Trump as well. Latina voters moved towards Trump. Even black women marginally moved towards Trump. It's not just a guy thing. The guy thing is bigger, but it's all over the place. And we obviously, we paid for that. Let me come back here one more time. Let's see here. Okay. All right. I just want to take a quick second, and these are some of the exit polls, the national exit polls that came out. I just want to take a quick gander at this, and you can find this in a lot of places. I will have this up later tonight, so you can also refer to this on video, and I'll try to have a short version of it as well. You can see white non-college graduate men, 68 to 30 Trump. White college graduate men, 49-48 Harris. That was close in 2020. It was close this time as well. You can see white non-college graduate women, 62-37 Trump. So it's not just a guy thing. I mean, look at this. Harris won independent voters 50 to 45. So, but the Hispanic voter element from a national perspective was probably as decisive as anything. And getting a different composition of men to show up made a really big difference in what otherwise could have been a bit of a problem. So let me stop the share right there, and let me go to the chat. One of the things that I've already talked to a number of folks, including some of you here. I think and I see a few folks saying it here. We cannot wait until the end of 2025 or wait till 2026 to be really working on understanding what happened and making tactical and strategic changes. I think we need to think a lot about what we want in a gubernatorial nominee in 2026. And it's gonna be very difficult to defeat Kelly Ayotte as a first-term incumbent. But I will tell you this, as somebody who ran in 2018, knowing I was trying to beat a first-term incumbent, part of the reason I got in, I was well aware of the history, was because Trump got in and we knew that the first midterm had the potential to be a dumpster fire for the first-term incumbent president. Now, this is a weird one. We got Grover Cleveland and we got Trump, and that's it. I don't know whether or not being the second time a first-term president, in effect, will necessarily have the same impact. But I think we have to assume that it could. And maybe most importantly, I would say this: whether you're running for state house, state senate, executive council, governor, you can't wait until you know it's going to be a great night to commit to doing it. There is risk in making the decision early because some of you could run the best campaign ever. And, if Kelly's getting 64% of the vote, it's really tough to win no matter how good a job you do. But I can tell you that in 2018, we had a real chance to beat Sununu, and we kind of fumbled it. And I have every reason to believe that 2026 could be a very good year to be a Democratic candidate. And I think that's the optimism that we got to have, not based on blind optimism. It's based on history. And there's a lot more data we have to look at. Zoe had a question. How is the national polling so off? Here's what I would say. I'm not sure the national polling was that far off. It basically, it was at the top of the margin of error, falling on the Republican side. If Trump won by a larger margin than he won in 16 or that Biden won in 20 in terms of the swing states. But what Trump really did is in the states that were not the swing states, he made enormous progress in New York and California and Illinois and New Jersey. I mean, he lost Illinois by less than 8 points. He lost California by less than 20. I mean, he was losing it by more than 30. He made 10 to 15 point improvement. He lost New Jersey by 5. Obviously, he's lost New Hampshire by less than 3. I mean, this was an enormous election, and there's a lot to learn. Chuck with a good comment here. Look, the state budget is going to be a true challenge next year. We already see that revenues are dropping below the projections. There's every reason to believe that will continue. And the next legislature and governor are going to have that handed to them, and they're going to have to make difficult decisions. We know that when that happens, the politics can get pretty messy. We also know that Republicans have a trifecta. Trifectas tend to overreach. Maybe they'll be more disciplined, but they don't have to listen to us at all if they don't want to. They can pass whatever they want. And when parties have that, they usually end up passing some pretty crazy stuff because they start worrying more about primaries and they start worrying more about insular things than about the middle of the road folks. So there's a lot of reasons to think this could get a lot better in 2 years, but we can't wait 2 years to do that. And so one thing that I would offer to you all in your respective communities is as early, some of you I'm sitting down, some of your committees I'm getting together, I think even before Thanksgiving, but much more in December, and we'll have much more data. We'll understand a lot more in a few months, in a month, and really digging in about 2026. It may be discouraging right now, but I really do think that 2 years from now could be a hell of a night. But it will be 23 and a half months of work to get there. But at least I wanted to share this information just to try to get on the same page. A couple other questions here. I think there was one about the Free Staters. Let me see here. I'll be honest, I don't know how many Free Staters are in the current Republican majority. They have a 222 seat majority. Jason Osborne was one of the most interesting figures in state politics over the last 4 years. I think, and those of you in the legislature can correct me, it appears to me that he overreached early on in a leadership role. He became a much more public figure, and it was very unattractive. And I think his own caucus understood that. And he backed off in the last 2 years, backed off of some of the most extreme language, extreme public pronouncements. Jason became less of the face of the Republican Party in the last 2 years than he was the prior 2 years. He was more disciplined. We're going to have to see if they can continue that discipline. The one estimate was at least 40 that are free staters. I see Donna saying it could be far more than that. Obviously, there are a lot of folks that would not call themselves free staters, but would have pretty strong libertarian leaning. These folks will reveal themselves in the weeks and months to come, and we have to hold them accountable. Anyway, all right. So that's all I got. You guys have been, you probably are still tired from the other night. I'll keep looking at some of these questions. But does anybody, and I'm looking for hands, you could use that, or you can unmute yourself. I believe you can. You can ask a question. We'll take some general questions that you might have about this or anything else. I don't see any there. Let me look in the chat again here.
I'd like to ask a question, please.
Oh, sure, of course.
Hi, thank you. This is Jessica Scheinman. And thank you so much for this. This is terrific. I think the one thing we need to consider is disinformation in the campaign and the election. And that was so prevalent. And I wonder how we can address that going forward.
You said misinformation.
Disinformation.
Oh, disinformation.
Intentional disinformation and right-wing control of media in so many markets.
It's a good point. From a national perspective, Republicans have been, you hear it called the conservative project. There's tremendous literature on this going back. I mean, honestly, some of this stuff goes back to the post-Goldwater era in the 60s and 70s. This is where the rise of Reagan was the most public part of it, but far from the only, where they realized, they said, we're going to create our own basically infrastructure. And in so doing, we're going to make the established infrastructure look like they're the left. So they were shifting the norms over time. And that's where you got Heritage Foundation. That's where you got judicial networks that were grooming young attorneys to become judges and justices. This is why Donald Trump in 2016 was able to say in the primary when Ted Cruz had a chance to beat him, and he said, I promise that I will pick justices only from this list. And he showed people the list. And that list had one thing in common. They had all been approved by a conservative think tank that all of them had committed in pretty public ways to overturning Roe if given the opportunity. So that allowed him to get the evangelical support in the 2016 primary that was so critical to avoiding losing the nomination to probably Ted Cruz would have been the person. So and then it's talk radio. And here's something for you. And this gets back to the guy thing a little bit. One of the things that I'm working on, it's not a public thing, it's not ready yet, but as I look at what I want to do for the next 2 years, look, the New Hampshire media landscape is decimated. I started doing this stuff in the early 2000s. Local papers are largely decimated. They are unable to cover civic life on a daily basis. Some of them are trying, but I mean, the Concord Monitor was one of the best small newspapers in the country for decades. They have been decimated. The Nashua Telegraph doesn't even have local reporters. The Seacoast has consolidated all their papers, but they also have gotten rid of almost all their reporters. It's a different world completely. And NHPR, their coverage ability is largely decimated compared to 20 years ago. So it is podcast. It is niche. I mean, it's niche broadcasting. It's social media platforms, even Twitter. I mean, I still use Twitter in part because it's a way to get things out there. But Twitter has adjusted. Obviously, Elon Musk is a central part of the next Trump administration. So we're going to have to create our own networks of communication. So one of the things that I'm looking to do is a podcast. It's a podcast network that would not just be politics, although there certainly would be an element of that. And it can't be high-minded stuff. If you're only talking to high engagement Democrats on a podcast, then it's going to be nice to get a couple hundred people, and you're going to be drinking from NHPR mugs, and it'll be delightful, and it won't actually move the needle on anything. It has to be talking in ways and about topics and with guests who are stretching it out in the same way that some of these, in the Rogan-esque way, that they've been able to successfully do. That's the only way, because if we're gonna have to create, just as the conservative movement did, we're gonna have to create our own, and we can do some of that at the state level, and we can do it with social media platforms. We can do it with podcasts. I'm not saying it's easy, but this is much bigger than just, you know, being good at knocking on doors in the fall every other year. This is going to be something that's a much bigger project. Chuck, I see your hand is up.
Steve, thanks. Yeah, one of the things, I was in Concord today and I sat down with a couple of current representatives who got reelected. And one of the things that I saw in my campaign and they saw in their campaigns, and I think, they were all in pretty much in agreement that transgenderism, LGBTQ issues, they, them, is something the Democratic Party has really embraced. Walmart shoppers don't buy into that stuff. And it affected them. I mean, my opponent sent out a flyer against me with a muscular guy with a beard and a mustache in a women's bathing suit with a bunch of young children around him at a pool saying, this is what Chuck Grassley supports, men playing girls' sports. And, I know that with the high participation Democratic voter that we get, that's not really an issue for them. But it's those people we need to get. That Walmart voter, they don't see that. They don't embrace that kind of stuff. I had a feeling early on, just because of the way some of the votes went in the House this year, that they were going to use that against us with a lot of working class people. And I think it was an effective thing that they did against us. The Democratic Party goes out of its way. That Palestinian issues, these are not state issues. They shouldn't be state issues. We need to be careful in how we deal with these things. I mean, we certainly don't want to let, throw LGBT people out on the streets. But the thing is that we can't make that one of our primary issues.
One of the things that the data show is that low engagement Democrats generally agree on the issues with high engagement Democrats. For example, they're just as pro-choice. They're as supportive as the LGBTQ plus community. They believe that climate change is real. You get the idea. The difference is not on how they feel about the issue. It's on how they prioritize the issues that matter. So the wrong thing to do, and I know you're not saying this, Chuck, the wrong thing to do would not be to be like suddenly, talking trash about the LGBTQ community,
No.
or to moderate on abortion rights, or that's not really it at all. But however, folks are like, listen, when I can't afford my groceries, I don't have the bandwidth to be focused on, a lot of other issues that, frankly, high engagement Democrats in polling show are their top 4 or 5 issues, but are not in the top 4 or 5 for any other group except for that one cohort. And indeed, the one cohort that Harris increased meaningful percentage of the vote over Biden in 20 was high education women, college degree women. And if you go to a county or a local Democratic committee meeting, and you look at, and I've done this exercise, at the percentage of people that will be at the room. These are your highest engagement activists, obviously. They're showing up on a Tuesday night in a town and this sort of thing. It will regularly be 70+% women, almost all of whom have a college degree. And we need to continue to consolidate that support. But understanding that what we in the room might say, these are my top 5 issues, may not be what 75+% of the country would call their top 5 issues. So it's not about agreeing on the issue, it's about the prioritization of how we communicate about it oftentimes. Deborah, I think I see your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in answer to what Chuck said, I put it in the chat earlier. 30,000 times the ad on transgenders ran in Pennsylvania against Harris. They did not respond. I think this is a serious issue, and I think it's a serious issue that happened in the state legislature last year with all the fights around certain parts of that. It doesn't mean we're anti anything, but it's how we present it and how we get pegged or how we respond. So I think that's a very big issue. That fits into the culture wars, that they see the Democratic Party is really elitist and really stuck on certain different key things. That's true across the country. Yeah.
I would argue when we talk about, there's certain issues that when we talk about them with great regularity, as almost at the same frequency at times, it seems, as economic issues. One of the things that I think we unwittingly do is we imply that there are tons of dudes with beards dressing as women and playing high school volleyball with girls, when part of the thing here is the kind of situations that people are fear-mongering about pretty much never happen. Like this is a non-issue in terms of the scary stuff people throw out there. But if we talk about it a lot, it implies that it's happening a lot.
Well, or even if you talked about it some and it becomes a key thing. I agree with you. That's the point. So we have to, think about how to handle that.
We're putting porno in books to third graders. I mean, that doesn't happen.
No.
But the thing is that they say it's happening. And we're not responding correctly to the issue.
I agree.
And sometimes we blow things way out of proportion, book burning and book banning and everything. And you're right, Steve. I think this is not a priority for most people. Those Walmart shoppers are not concerned about porno in the classroom or, the transgenderism. But when the Republicans blow it up, sometimes people think, and we respond the way we do, which is being overly defensive on a lot of this stuff. They think that that's all the Democrats are concerned about.
I agree.
And that hurts us.
They're drive the conversation. I saw Karen Leod Hill had her hand up a moment ago. I don't know if Karen, if I don't see on the screen right now, but if you had a question, please, sorry about that. It took a second to get to you.
Hey, hi everyone. Sorry, I'm in my car here. I caught in for the tail end, and I just would encourage us to be really careful about creating either or situations. I think this is a both and from my perspective, in my primary, I spent a lot of time with high engagement Democratic voters. That was almost exclusively where I spent time because those are primary voters. But since then, after the primary, I have been knocking doors almost exclusively in the red towns or redder towns in my district. And what I saw firsthand is that people are struggling. People are not able to pay their bills. People are, I can't tell you how many porches I stood on that I thought I was going to fall right through. And I could see that, the windows are cracked and there's no insulation and people have, are missing teeth, and like that, the things that are concerning to them are really economic issues. And I think that for us as Democrats, I think instead of creating an either or and saying we need to do less of this or less of that, I think we have to make sure that economic justice is really one of the engines of our policy and our vision moving forward. It's not instead of, though. It's alongside. We have to protect the people. And in the next 2 years, we know that in the legislature, the attacks are going to continue and they're going to be worse. And we have less leverage now to deal with them. And we're going to have to stand up for the people that need to be stood up for. And we're going to have to be even louder. But we also have to, I do think that I do think that economic justice has to become a really important issue for us, that we think about how we can actually make a difference in people's daily lives. And that's really what I saw firsthand on the campaign trail, especially over the last 8 weeks, that people are struggling and we need to find ways to help them.
Right on, thank you. I think, did I see another hand? Let's see. No, let's see. One thing I saw is that there was a Gen X question, which I thought was interesting. I don't usually see it. it is true. By far the generation that is voting most consistently conservative for Republicans and big time for Trump this week is Gen X. Now, as a member of Gen X, I'm 50. I was born in 1974. This does not surprise me. We were born and raised in the Reagan era, and there's a lot of research that shows that if your parents are conservative or liberal, that tends to move you there over the long run. And the politics of when you were developed, it disproportionately play a role. And so for people around my age, from mid 40s through mid 50s, certainly, there is it's the most conservative generation right now. One thing I would say, I go back to it. I'm a broken record, but I believe this in my bones. New Hampshire is one of the, I think, third or fourth highest percentage of the population in the country that is Gen X. If we're looking, and right now, and for the next 5 years, Gen X is the biggest part of the voting electorate. It's not a big, it's a small generation compared to the boomers and the millennials, but because of our age, for this little window, we are the single biggest voting bloc by age, probably for the rest of the decade. So this is what we're running into in New Hampshire. We have the most conservative age cohort that is, for now, the largest voting cohort, and New Hampshire has one of the largest percentages of any state in the country that has that cohort. And I think it's really important. You look, when it comes to governor, always take the best political athlete. We need to start nominating people with high ceilings because it's going to take high ceiling to win. But the other part is the Gen X element is the match. Kelly is Gen X. Chris Sununu, Gen X. We have, the irony is our young congressional delegation of Chris and Maggie, they're actually technically not Gen X, they're technically millennial. So the Democrats don't have a whole lot of Gen X in the pipeline right now in New Hampshire. And to the extent we can cultivate that for the next 5 to 10 years, it'd be very advantageous just based on the numbers. And the Republicans in New Hampshire have really pushed that button hard between Sununu and now Ayotte. I don't know if it's intentional, but it's a big advantage that we need to see if we can counter that. Genevieve, I think I saw your hand up a moment ago.
Yes, it was. I wanted to respond about the economy, and I do agree. I canvassed a lot in Carroll County in District 3, and economy was a very big issue. But all over our towns, the Republicans had this very effective message: Trump low prices, Kamala Harris high prices. And one of the big signs that I think cost Bill Marsh a lot of votes was Bill Marsh higher taxes. And even speaking with people, I asked, well, how are you getting your information, about higher prices? Because I could keep very specifically pointing to things that Republicans are doing in New Hampshire that will lead to higher prices, like the education vouchers, draining money from public school education. They're getting their information from Newsmax, YouTube News. And I feel like it's certainly where I am in District 3, we paid very little attention to getting video out. I canvassed one woman who was very concerned about negative ads on Bill Marsh. She said, I cannot get a knitting video without seeing a negative ad about Bill Marsh.
I heard similar kinds of things, Genevieve. The video element, I mean, look, in my own, if you saw my email today, slowly moving towards where you see successful political movements and candidates going. So long form moving to Substack, moving more of the written word to video, moving towards podcast. And what I'm looking at is something that will actually combine politics and sports more explicitly. Because one of the things we find in polling is sports. Majority of the consumption of sports, particularly professional sports, is male. Not exclusively, obviously, but disproportionately. It is becoming, if you do polling, people that say they are particularly big fans of their favorite football, baseball, basketball, hockey team are increasingly self-identifying as Republican or conservative. And that wasn't always the case. We're losing a lot of folks. And it's not a coincidence that Donald Trump was running the they, them. She's for they, them. Donald Trump's for you during NFL football, which I thought I get the Sunday ticket, so I have the 4 games on the screen at once. And I must have seen the they, them ad, during one NFL block, a 3-hour block, 50 times, 40 times. It's pretty crazy. So it's, that's the thing. Erica DeVries, I know you did. I'm not sure you had a note in the chat and I missed it, but I wanted you to ask a question because I think it was about the deployment of resources on campaigns, and you know a ton about this. Maybe if you had a question or you had a comment about that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, Steve, you have been a prolific fundraiser through this cycle and the last at least. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, we're talking a lot about the content of messaging, and I want to talk a little bit about the resourcing of messaging. So do you have any thoughts about how it is that we raise and deploy resources on a town and a county and a state basis that will allow us to start framing more effectively some of these arguments?
It's a really important question, and I have spent. If I had the bandwidth, because I learn a lot from the candidates, I learn a lot from the committees. Obviously, I've been around this for 22 years. And then, look, I may have been pretty good at raising money for my PAC. Unfortunately, I wasn't good enough raising money for my gubernatorial campaign, which was part of my eventual downfall. It wasn't a lack of effort or a lack of knowing how to do it. It's just in a primary in 2018, that's a bad time to be me. But at any rate, here's the thing. I think our party in general, and it's not exclusive to New Hampshire by any means, is extremely reliant on a couple of sources that I worry in the long run may not be there for us. You know how when you invest, you don't want to invest all of your retirement money in one area because if things don't go well, you're screwed. It's a little bit like that with fundraising. Right now, whether it's our various down ballot election committees, the state party, traditionally, we've been raising a lot of our money from 3 sources. One, national money. So like the Democratic, the national legislative folks, the Democratic Governors Association. It's national money in big chunks. Some of the PACs that are involved, some of them, I'm not going to name them. I'm not trying to be negative, but this sort of thing, they get almost over 90% of their money from a foundation or a Democratic entity. And the problem is when you do that, you don't build the fundraising muscle. You don't build a network. You don't diversify where you get your money. And sometimes that money runs dry. And when it does, you don't have a plan B. So that's one. The second is, and I've done a lot of work on this, and I know Karen, Leo Hill, and we've spent a lot of time on this year talking about it, working on it. A remarkably small number of New Hampshireites are responsible for a remarkably large percentage of Democratic candidate giving. I mean, it's a couple hundred people. And if you really want to get specific, it's like 20 people who are responsible for giving stunning percentages of the money. And I'm not going to throw names around, but I know a lot of folks. I see you on this call. You know exactly who I'm talking about. And the problem is this. I'm going to be very honest. Demographically, that pool of super donors that we're relying on for the majority of our money are aging out, and they're not getting replaced by younger people with similar financial capacity. And that means that if we don't address that in less than a decade, frankly, it's already happening. That well is gonna largely run dry. And we've not built the muscle for a wider collection. And then the third, traditionally at the state party level, was the presidential primary, which until recently we were able to charge and generally get between $75,000 and $150,000 per presidential campaign for the voter file. So in a year like, 2020, when we had 20 candidates running, many of them did not buy the file, but many of them did. And at 150 grand a pop, if 8 candidates buy it, that's $1.2 million into the coffers of the state party, which is awesome. Don't get me wrong. But new rules with the DNC have limited our ability to do something like that in the future. So that spigot is drying up. So I've just identified 3 places where a lot of the Democratic money in New Hampshire is getting raised, and all 3 of them, I'm not optimistic. So my PAC is about 98% in state, and I'd have to look at the end after the final report, but the vast majority of it is coming at $200 and less a pop. It's probably 95% generated from online emails. I did not do call time, not one time this year. And I think if I did, we could raise more. But there's that, like, it's growing a diverse pool of largely in-state people who are able to give small to mid-size amounts of money on a semi-regular basis. That is a sustainable way to raise money in New Hampshire. It's not the only way, but I think that's something that we need to do at the local county level. It's what we need our candidates to do better. Otherwise, I fear that the spigots we've been over relying on are not necessarily going to be there a decade from now. So that's my little rant on that. I hope that addresses it. And I think there's a lot of work to do on that. That could be done at the local and county level. And Erica, you know a ton about this. So you're in the middle of helping make that better yourself. Walter, you've had your hand up for a little while. How are you?
I'm recovering
Yeah.
slowly. But my comment is kind of ties into what Eric was talking about, because as you know, Eric has helped us in Stratford County raise a reasonable amount of money to support candidates. And it also ties into your comment about podcasts. One of the things I've been thinking about where we have in Stratford County, like Carroll County, held our own against in this election. We didn't gain any seats, but we didn't lose any seats. But no county gained seats. And so I was thinking, where are the holes in this election? And the biggest hole that I see, and it's going to involve money, is we engage the electorate the year of the election. By the time we get our messaging and everything out, they're getting it maybe in June, July, August. And it sounds like propaganda. You're telling them what you're going to do, even though they haven't heard from you in 2 years. Okay, so we have to think about a way, and I like your idea about a podcast, but that costs money too. So how do we engage the voters starting in early 2025 or 2026, so they see what our legislators are fighting for, whether they lose or they win, but they're fighting for that everybody on education, on all kinds of stuff, environment, so that they see that the reader can't read a 4-page document. They can't read a 500-page essay, but they get it in small bite-sized pieces just to show how everybody who they elect, what they're doing that works for them or it doesn't work for them. I think that by the time the election rolls around, they'll be much more comfortable realizing that they've been hearing this all along, and they'll understand what's going on in Concord. Most of our voters don't know what's going on in Concord. And I don't think, because when you're putting all that information out in July, August, September, you're competing against a ton of information that's coming out to them all the time, and they just don't get through all of it. But we have the opportunity next year to keep this up, but it's going to involve not raising enough money for just the last 6 months of the election, but the entire next 2 years. So we got to think about, how do we want to engage it? How do we make it? How do we message it? And how do we make it engaging and not just like it's propaganda?
So this may not be where you think I'd go with this, but Howard Stern, who has become a much more kind of mainstream and docile figure, 40 years in, 50 years in, If
Yeah.
you've ever seen the movie
Yeah.
Private Parts, which is actually kind of sneaky, well done, although not appropriate at work or with the children. There's a scene relatively early in it where a young Paul Giamatti plays an NBC executive when Howard Stern was on the rise in NBC in New York, and they don't know what to do with the guy. This is before he's a superstar. Like, what do we do with this guy? He says completely inappropriate things. Sponsors are canceling. People say they're not going to listen anymore. So they did a survey of the listeners. And I'm not going to get the exact numbers right, but this is the point, and it will connect, Walter, to what you said. And it's this. They go, so what are the people who say they like him? How long do they listen? They go, well, the average person who likes him listens for 34 minutes at a time, which was an absurdly long amount for a radio hit. And they go, why do they keep listening? And they said the number one reason is because they want to find out what he's going to say next. Then they said, okay, what about the people that don't like him? Oh, they listen for an average of 42 minutes each time. And they go, well, why do they listen for even longer? Because they want to find out what he's going to say next. And this is the thing. Like the Zsa Zsa Gabor, I don't care what you say about me, just spell my name right. Like there's something to be said. Like we all, as activist Democrats who are now an hour and a half into this 2 nights after the election, so I know you're into it. We are like, I can't believe anybody would vote for Donald Trump. Did you see him at McDonald's? Come on, man. Did you see him get into that dump truck after the whole garbage comment? He almost fell when he missed the handle and ha ha ha. Nobody's going to vote for this guy. And then he basically realigns America with the most Republican majority, percentage of the vote since George Bush in 2004. I'm sorry, and maybe since Bush in 88. We are misunderstanding that what Trump understands better, by the way, also a product of the same era as Howard Stern in New York City, that it's being interesting is the most important thing. It would help if you were intelligent as well, but be interesting. So I saw Katie Cutshall had a comments here on the chat. A few years ago, Gene Deitch sponsored, and I really enjoyed it, a podcast, Granite State Matters. I co-hosted it for a while with Terry, and then eventually I was the solo host. And I would get feedback that I was good at it because I have a radio voice. I was going to be a sportscaster when I started college, and sports is the hobby, politics is the business. And I'm good. I know what to do with this stuff. But here's the thing. The listenership, from what I understand, was very sticky within an audience, but it failed to expand beyond that because we would talk for 40 minutes about the education funding formula. So for people like you, we were expanding our listenership within a certain universe. We would call them high engagement Democrats, basically. High education, higher income. They'd hop in their Volvo and they'd listen to it while they were driving to whatever. But that's not what we need to do, actually. That's fine, right? That's good. But what we need to do is get the people that are low engagement Democrat, low to medium engagement, undeclared and independent. And what do those people like to listen to? Well, they don't want to talk about the education funding formula. They really don't.
Right.
So we need to talk about what they like talking about. Now, I go back to sports. Sports is the great equalizer. The only reason why cable television even exists, the cable bundle, is because of live sports. That's the only thing keeping cable television alive. People watch it. 97 of the top 100 programs on TV last year were live sports. That's where it's at. So to me, that's the obvious place where Democrats should be going, especially given this sort of blowing up gender divide between the parties. It is much easier to go from 34% of the male vote to 40% of the male vote than it is to go from 55% of the female vote to 56% of the female vote. We're starting to run into ledge in terms of the female vote because we're already getting a ton of it. There's a ton of former Democratic men waiting for the next thing. And they used to vote for us, and they don't now. And they're there sitting for us if we're willing to go get it. And I think it's not just sports, but that's one of the places. And this is what Trump understood and JD Vance understood. And by the way, JD Vance is an excellent fit for this cohort. And I think this has been a long time strategy of their campaign. But it's the key is to be interesting 24/7, 24 months of the 2-year cycle, and it may not even be about politics. And that's okay. In fact, it's better. Lou, your hand's been up for a while.
It was up earlier. Thanks, Steve. While we're on the subject of money earlier, how has the lack of DGA funding affected us at the top of the ticket or for the governor's races, besides what we might deem not maybe the best candidates of some of these races in the past 5 elections or so?
Well, I would say this in 24, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. I think the DGA came through pretty big in 2024. I would argue the RGA may have come through even bigger. So there may have still been a funding gap, but the DGA this time stuck around in a way that in 22 and 20, I think they saw them as non-competitive races. And so they moved their DGA money to competitive races. In 2018, they put some money in, but I think they also did not see it as a top tier. And in 2016, they did a pretty good job of funding it with Colin. But from my understanding of that race, they kind of pulled back a little bit, and that's too bad because that was a really close race. In the DGA world, like the RGA world, it's funny. Sometimes you're not even so much competing against the Republican, you're competing against the other governor's races around the country. And so they look at it. So like take this cycle. There were only 2 gubernatorial races in 2024 that were generally seen as top tier competitive, us and North Carolina, until Mark Robinson, the lieutenant governor of North Carolina, the Republican, went bananas. And then even Trump was like, I don't know this guy. All right. When Trump is like, you're too outrageous for me, then you're really outrageous. And so that ended up redirecting money that probably would have gone to North Carolina back up to us. So we were pretty lucky there. But in the long run, look, we have to be interesting. We have to be competitive. We have to get the attention. It won't just come to us. We have to be interesting. We have to prove we can be competitive. I think we have to be novel. Often, I think in the last 30 years, I'm not sure why, but I feel like the lesson of the Democratic Party oftentimes has been that charisma it's a bug. I think it's a feature, actually. I mean, I think that's true. I'm surprised that's even arguable. Energy is an asset. Being interesting is not a bug. It means once in a while you'll say something that'll make people uncomfortable. But I don't know how much more evidence we need than the last 3 elections that it's okay to say things that make people a little uncomfortable if in exchange you're regularly grabbing people by the lapels and providing compelling content for people to consider in an election. Let's see. I'll take a quick look here at the chat. I realize I've missed a bunch of the chat. See if there's anything here. Let's see here. Yeah, it's true. People looked at the chart. The Gen X majority for Trump by far more than anybody any other cohort. Also, Gen Z men are moving towards Trump. So it's definitely a younger voter thing. Let's see here. All right. I've taken a lot of your time. You've been very patient to stick with this. If you'd like to do some programming at your local or county committee levels, would love to do that. We can tailor it to your region. There's some issue-related stuff that if you want to get into messaging, we can do that in the weeks to come. There's a lot of stuff in the pipeline, and I'm glad to looking to expand in 2025, expand the kind of the mission of the PAC, because there's not going to be an election in 2026. But messaging would be a big part of it, and some policy, but also trying to build communications networks. No idea is a bad idea at this early juncture. And if you want to get folks together to have a broader discussion, not unlike what we're doing tonight, I think this is a time when you get a very good audience, a very engaged audience. People are very passionate. I think we want to leave people with optimism and vision and direction. And we can do that at the local and county level. So you can send an email through the website, and we can talk about that in the weeks to come, and go from there. Let me look one more time in the chat to make sure there isn't a question here that we're leaving. Let's see here. Let's see. I don't see anything else. All right. With that, I will upload this tonight. By later tonight, the presentation will be up on the YouTube channel. Please, if you would, consider going to Substack and subscribing. It's free. Subscribe to my Substack. I'm increasingly going to be putting long-form content on there and less via email. I don't want to annoy people. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're not doing that already. Short and longer form video. Stay tuned for podcast-related things. When that comes online, please subscribe to that and spread it with your friends. That's how we get the word out more. But those would be my requests for you in the near term. That's the thing you could do that would help me the most to be more helpful back to you, I think. And with that, I think we'll call it an evening. All right. Thank you guys very much. Great to see you. Be strong. 2026 is only like 700 and, I don't know, 25 days away. But anyway, all right. We will see you guys soon. Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.